actually do my little thing. Hello, everyone.
Sound on?
I think they hear me? Yes, good, okay. My name is Karen Beck, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Bethlehem Historical Association. Good crowd again tonight. This is our last program of the season. It's going so fast. We'll be back in September, but we do want to stop tonight and thank everyone at the library, all our friends at the library, especially Sarah back here and Luke and Jeff, for being so flexible and so supportive as we adjusted to this new venue that has worked so well for us. I also want to recognize Mary Kelly, who's hiding in the hall. She's our program chair, and she has arranged all of the speakers, so you should know about her. She's almost totally responsible for our actually being here. Mary just cheerfully adapts to everything, if you know her, right? Mary, I'm talking about you. And as we worked through all the details and tended to those wrinkles that came along, she just made it so comfortable. So thank you, Mary, and thank you to the library. I want to encourage you to come down and visit us at the museum. It's in the Cedar Hill Schoolhouse, 1859 schoolhouse, which is interesting in itself. And it is located on Route 144 and Clapper Road. We're open every Sunday from 2 to 4. We'd love to see you, so be sure to stop by. Mark Peckham, we're going to get to Mark because that's why you're here. Mark retired from a long career in historic preservation. It includes serving in positions involved with urban conservation and architecture. From 1983 on to 2015, he worked for the New York State Division of Historic Preservation in several capacities. He is a trustee, a longtime trustee of the Kingston Maritime Museum. Mark shares a great love for all things watercraft related: boating, paddling, sailing, wreck diving, right? Not driving, wreck diving. He has experience in building and sailing replicas, and his many hobbies include writing, storytelling, drawing, painting, ship model restoration. Tonight, he's going to share just some of his knowledge of the steamboat era. So that's why you're here, and here he is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here tonight. I wanted to add one more thing. I'm a former Bethlehem resident. I grew up in Bethlehem, went to Bethlehem Central, came back, raised my family in Bethlehem, but the lure of the river brought me to New Baltimore about 17 years ago. So I live on the river, but still have a lot of affection for Bethlehem, and I'm very pleased that so many people were interested in coming out tonight, so thank you very much. We're going to talk about steam navigation on the Hudson River. I'm representing the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston. We have some literature on the table. We hope you'll take time in the future to come down, see what we're all about. I'll tell you a little bit more about that toward the end of our program. And I want to make sure we have time at the conclusion of the program to take your questions. But if there's something that doesn't make any sense to you as we're going along, feel free to stand up, blurt it out, and we'll try to answer that question as we move along if there are too many of them. So here's some of the things I'd like to touch on as we go through tonight. We'd like to talk about how steam came to be developed on the Hudson River. How did people move on the river before steam? What was its role in the New York State economy? How did it relate to the railroads? And finally, what ended steam? How did economic conditions and the rise of diesel doom steamboats? So we'll try to cover those topics and a lot of others as we proceed tonight. So First, we're going to talk about what happened before there was steam on the Hudson River. For 200 years, people managed to trade, ship goods, travel back and forth between New York and Albany on one of the best waterways in the world, the Hudson River. It's a tidal waterway, perfect for sailing vessels. This is a Hudson River sloop. There's another schooner in the background. These vessels were slow, but they made steady progress. If the tide was adverse, they could just set down an anchor or tie up on a pier and wait until the tide was favorable. If the wind was adverse, they'd stop and wait until the wind was good. So the trip between Albany and New York could take anywhere from 2 days to perhaps 10, and nobody was too terribly concerned about it. It was a very pleasant form of travel, and it served the colony extremely well for 200 years. But it had its limitations. You know, one of the common misconceptions about sail and steam is that when steam was invented and became successful on the Hudson River, sailing vessels went out of business. But it's not true. They operated side by side for almost a century, as this Bartlett engraving demonstrates. Here we have a Hudson River sloop in the foreground and a steamboat with an arrangement of barges tied to its side proceeding down through the Hudson Highlands. What happened as steamboats became popular, the passengers gravitated to steam because of the comfort and the speed, but the bulk freights still found it cheaper to ship by sail. They didn't have to be in New York in 2 days or 1 day. They could take a week to get there. So sail continued to operate successfully. In fact, sail made its greatest improvements on the eve of the Civil War. The boats became faster, they developed clipper bows, they had lower freeboard, and they managed to reduce the sail rigs by taking advantage of the schooner rig. The sails were smaller, and these boats could operate with smaller crews. You might have needed a crew of 6 to operate the boat on the left, but a crew of 4 could handle the boat on the right. And so they continued to eke out a living almost until about 1900. And if you want to get an idea of what one of these is like, or you want to experience sailing on one, the replica sloop Clearwater, built in 1969 by Pete Seeger, it's an excellent replica. It gives you the feeling of how these things operated and how they were able to carry goods and materials up and down the river. So here we are with the North River Steamboat, Robert Fulton, Robert Livingston, 1807. This is really the introduction of the era of steam on the Hudson River. How do we get here? Well, Hudson River was the ideal laboratory to prove the concept because it was tidal, the current wasn't that strong, and there was a lot of money in New York. There was capital built to invent and build this boat. And I've got to say right here, one of the misconceptions about Robert Fulton, he did not invent the steamboat. There were many people experimenting with steamboats in Europe and in the United States as early as the 18th century. But Robert Fulton was an exceptionally talented engineer and businessman, and he was able to figure out scientifically how to make it work and how to make it earn a living for itself. And then he was able to connect with Robert Livingston, who had the money and the political influence to protect the enterprise with a monopoly so that no competitors could infringe on what they were doing. So by the time there was real competition, they really had a great product. So the two men met in Paris in 1802 and formed a partnership. And in 1803, Robert Fulton built his first demonstration steamboat on the Seine in Paris and operated it successfully. It was about 70 feet long, about half the size of the North River Steamboat. And when everybody saw how that worked, he packed up his bags, went to England, bought a Bolt & Watt engine, had it packed and sent to New York. And in 1806, he was building the North River Steamboat down in New York City at Noah Brown's shipyard. It exceeded all expectations. This boat, in order to preserve the monopoly that Chancellor Livingston had created, had to sail 4 miles an hour faster than the tide. So the boat did that. It sailed 5 miles an hour up the river and got to Albany in 32 hours and returned in 30 hours. It was a sensation. But of course, people who were used to shipping passengers and freight by sail were alarmed by this machine. They knew more would be built. They knew they would lose some business. And so immediately there were sabotage attempts. There were copyists who tried to copy the steamboat and run competition against the monopoly. And so Livingston and Fulton fought for years and years and years through the courts, through different authorities to try to suppress the illegal competition and hold up the monopoly. They began selling franchises to people that wanted to operate their own businesses elsewhere. And then they made a very bold move. They also got a monopoly on the Louisiana Purchase, all the rivers in the Louisiana Purchase, including the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio. They had a monopoly that would protect them for 30 years to operate steamboats there. And as important as steam became on the Hudson River, it was vastly more important on the Mississippi, because the Mississippi is a one-way river. It doesn't have a tide that will carry you back inland. You can only go downstream with a raft or with a sailing vessel. You can't buck the current unless you have mechanical propulsion. So the invention actually had far more implications for the national economy on the western rivers. But some disruptors ultimately were successful. On the left we have Thomas Gibbons, and on the right we have Cornelius Vanderbilt. You've heard of him before, I'm sure. Well, anyway, Gibbons had a federal coasting license. He built a boat called the Bologna, and he wanted to run passengers into New York in violation of New York's monopoly that gave all that trade to the Fulton and Livingston interests. So for years, there's this cat and mouse game that goes on. He hires Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's a local tough kid, but very skilled waterman from Staten Island, to protect his interests and pilot his boat. And there are any number of attempts to arrest these people, to impound the boat, to prevent it from operating, and Vanderbilt outwits them all. Some of the stories are hilarious. I'll just tell you one because we could go on for a long time talking about this. In one case, they were all set to arrest him on the New York docks, and when they went on board and went up to the pilot house, it was a woman steering the boat, and that was bad form to arrest a woman. So they let her go that time. So they always had some trick up their sleeve to prevent people from being arrested or stopping the boat from operating. Anyway, it finally came to a head in 1824 and went to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is 199 years ago, and that's where the Interstate Commerce Clause was really well established by the U.S. Supreme Court, stating that under federal law, the states cannot create a monopoly situation. They cannot regulate interstate transportation. And that was the end of the monopoly. So immediately there was a huge expansion in competition, steamboats, and a lot of disreputable practices. I want to talk technologically about how the boats progressed in very rapid order. Now you remember the North River steamboat traveled 5 miles an hour. By the 1820s, when the Supreme Court decision is made, boats like the one on the left could do about 10 miles an hour. And by 1835, when this boat, the Swallow, was built, these boats were doing 16 or 17 miles an hour. That's 3 times faster than Fulton's original boat. So the technology improved very, very rapidly. And the Swallow on the right is important because it kind of sets the stage for the next 40 years in the way these boats are configured. Some interesting features. You'll note that they have guards that protect the paddle wheels. It's a little overhanging deck, and they place the boilers and the smokestacks on those guards. The engine's in the center of the boat, and you have a walking beam engine in the middle. It's transmitting the power from a single steam cylinder to a crankshaft, which rotates the paddle wheels. It's really a great model, and you also see a truss work, that white thing that goes between the smokestacks. That's called a hogging truss. These wooden boats are getting long enough and big enough now and have enough vibration that they've got to be strengthened with some external mechanism. So for the remainder of the wooden boat era, most of these steamboats are going to have these hogging trusses. We talked about unsafe practices. You know, until the federal government really became involved in regulating steamboats, it was a wild west out there on the river and also on the Mississippi. This is the accident involving that same boat, the Swallow. She was racing. Everybody raced back then because that's how you got more customers. If you could be first to New York or first to your destination, you could charge more for your fare or get more passengers. And they did all kinds of rate cutting. Sometimes boats would leave without charging you anything just to keep the passengers from getting on a competition boat. It was literally the Wild West. But racing was dangerous. Snow squall came up while the Swallow was racing. Visibility was limited, and she ran into a rock in Athens called Noah's Brig. Broke in half, caught fire. A number of people were killed. And a few years after that, in 1851, Henry Clay caught on fire down in Irvington, New York, with a number of celebrities on board. And that seems to have been the last straw. The federal government came in with regulations in 1852, and things became safer on the river. You know, another thing that they used to do is they didn't always stop at every landing along the river the way they were supposed to. If you had a passenger who wanted to get out at Kingston, sometimes they just put him and his luggage in a small boat, tow him along. He'd have to steer to the dock. They'd throw him out. They had an extra couple lengths of rope to give him a few seconds. The line would snap taut, and they'd pull it back to the boat. The steamboat would never stop or slow down. It was really dangerous. And they'd take passengers on that way, too, if you were willing to go for it. But you had to be fast. You had to throw that baggage on and jump right in on top of it. So those things calmed down after the federal regulations of 1852. I show you this slide. This is the Mary Powell. She was really kind of the iconic steamboat of the Civil War era. And you can see she's still configured the same way the Swallow was configured, with paddle wheels in front, boilers on the guard, and you can see that rocking beam engine operating the boat. But she was a much more comfortable boat, and she was even faster. This boat could do 22 to 23 miles per hour, which is really pretty remarkable. And that's a speed very few boats ever achieved on the river until the 20th century. She was a very comfortable boat. She prided herself on passenger comfort, rectitude. You could get a nice meal here. In her later years, they had an orchestra. You could get your hair cut here by the barber, get your shoes shined. They had a seamstress on board. I mean, it was really a very comfortable way to travel to New York. And one of the nice features she had, I'm sorry I didn't think to put a photograph of this together, she carried a statue of Justice on her pilot house, which we haven't been able to verify, but I think it was a nod to the cause of abolition at the beginning of the Civil War. And she carried that statue on her pilot house until the 1890s and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. The statue still exists. She's in the Smithsonian Museum. And at some point, we'd like to bring her up to the Hudson River Maritime Museum for the public to see. Now, as we get into the Gilded Age, the focus on these large passenger steamboats is on comfort and luxury. And they began calling these boats the Palace Drawing Room Steamboats. And they were large, they were magnificent. Some of them were reaching 400 feet in length, which is really an amazing thing to do with wooden construction. It's also kind of scary when you think about fire. Put that many people on board a boat that's all built of wood that's that big. And you can see these massive hogging trusses that are stiffening these boats. They look like bridge segments, and it's basically what they are. They're going to keep the bow and the stern from sagging, and they're going to keep the engine vibrations to a minimum so that the boat doesn't shake herself to pieces. But amazing pieces of technology. The St. John up there is 400 feet in length.
What's the house in the background up on the hill?
I don't know. Good observation, but I haven't figured that out. I don't think it's there anymore. And the interiors were over the top, too. These are night boat interiors. They had staterooms. You could get on a night boat at Albany or Troy, take a stateroom, have dinner on the boat, have breakfast, and then get up and have a fresh start in New York in the morning. You know, we talk about these big grand steamboats, but I wanted to mention some of the smaller boats that operated between some of the smaller landings on the river. On the top, we have the sidewheel steamer Catskill. She operated out of the village of Catskill for years. And the T.S. Craig down below, she was a Rensselaer boat. Landings such as Rensselaer or Queemans or Cedar Hill, for that matter, they needed steamboat service too for commuters to get to larger destinations such as Albany, where they could get the larger boat if they needed to.
What was the lighting source in those big boats? Is it gas or oil?
Probably kerosene for a while, and ultimately they figured out how to put dynamos on the boat and light them with electricity, I think by the 1890s. This is the steamboat Albany. Do you notice anything different about her from the other boats we've seen? Yep. But she's also, she has no hogging truss anymore and no big masts, because now she's built out of iron. And she's stiffer. They don't have to have that extra structure to support her. A safer boat, stronger boat. And this is 1880. And this is where the technology changes once again. And some of the last of the big wooden boats include the Adirondack. She was a night boat. This boat was also 420 feet in length, I think. Just a monster boat with a huge capacity. I want to talk about railroads. We got a couple of railroad people in the audience I know today. And, you know, there's this misconception that railroads somehow put steamboats out of business, and it's just really not true. They had a symbiotic relationship together. Let's say you're in New York and the heat and humidity are bothering you, and you want to go to one of the resorts, like the Catskill Mountain House that was opened in 1824, or you want to take the mineral springs at Saratoga or Sharon Springs. You're going to want to take the steamboat to the landing that's nearest one of those sites, but then you're going to want a railroad to get you the rest of the way. And so a lot of the schedules were interconnected so that people could make those convenient transfers. So they helped each other in many ways. The first railroad that went from New York to Rensselaer was the Hudson River Railroad, and that opened in 1851. But it didn't put these steamboats out of business at all. It probably helped them a little bit. You see one of the steamboats right alongside the locomotive there, which is why I use this courier image. So they operated side by side the same way that sailing vessels operated side by side with the steamboats. And they helped each other. They were often owned by the same business interests, too. And let's face it, steamboat travel was much more luxurious. You could get up, move around, have a meal, pamper yourself, take in beautiful scenery. It was quiet. You had a nice breeze, or you could be in a somewhat cramped rail car, and they were a lot rougher than Amtrak is today. They'd juggle your bones quite a bit before you got to New York, and imagine they were pretty dusty too. And there wasn't anything to do on the train, no services to pamper you. You might get there a little faster, and maybe that was important. But if you had the time and the luxury to take a steamboat, it was a preferable way of traveling. We got to talk about freight a little bit. And one of the important things about the New York economy was the construction of canals in the 1820s. You had the Erie Canal that got completed in 1825. You had the Champlain Canal, completed in 1823. You had the Oswego Canal, the Seneca and Cayuga Canal, the Shenango Canal, and then you had the D&H Canal that opened in 1828 in Kingston. And the thing they all had in common was they all depended on the Hudson River to get their product to market in New York Harbor. And what better resource to move all of this freight than steamboats? So instead of having to put all this stuff in a warehouse in Albany and then unpack it and load it all onto a sloop, now you could just take the canal boat, make it up as part of a tow, and take a whole bunch of these canal boats down to market, which is what these big side-wheel steamboats did. The Norwich was originally a passenger boat, and then they stripped her down just to make her a towboat. And this is what one of these tows looked like. On the top, you see a tow made up of all kinds of boats. They had barges, they had sailing craft, they had lighters, whatever needed to go and was willing to pay the fare, being towed by one giant steam towboat. And you'll notice a little tugboat alongside the big side-wheel steam towboat. That's the helper tug. The helper tug comes in, detaches some of these barges, takes them to the landing where they need to go, and then returns maybe with another barge and puts it on the tow. So the tow never stops. Once it gets started in Albany and goes to New York, it never stops. Barges come and go with that little helper tug, but it just keeps chugging along at a very slow rate of speed, and nothing stops it. So we need to talk a bit about propeller steamboats. This is a propeller steam tugboat in a yard in Kingston called the Rob. Yacht-like lines. These are more maneuverable than the big side-wheel steamboats, but they require a deeper draft. And so now the state is interested in beginning to dredge the Hudson River in places so that these things can move a little bit more freely. And ultimately, these propeller steam tugboats take over the job of the side-wheel steam towboats. Another craft that goes along with this are the hay barges. You say, why is hay barges, why would they be important? Well, think about it. In the 19th century, all the surface transportation in New York City is animal-based. And each of those animals has to consume a dozen pounds of hay a day. I don't know what the figure was, but it was a lot of hay.
Not too many hayfields down there.
No hayfields down there, but there are a lot in Bethlehem and Queens and New Baltimore. And so there's a huge expansion of raising hay in the upper river valley, and all that hay goes to market on these boats that look like steamboats, but they don't have engines. They're towed to market. Queens was a big port for hay barges in this area. The Slingerlands ran quite a few of them. Got a question back there? No? Okay. And this view here on the right shows that they were used on Sunday for excursions. You know, it was expensive to take a steamboat ride in the late 19th century. It was about $1 or $2 to go from Albany to New York, and that was beyond most people's means. At that time, most people are earning about $1 a day. It's a lot more expensive than spending $45 and going down to New York on Amtrak. It was a big investment, and most people couldn't do it. But they could afford a trip on a hay barge on Sunday. And so Sunday schools, church groups, fraternal organizations, they would charter these hay barges on Sunday. They'd get picked up. They'd have music on board sometimes. They'd take them to a resort like Burin Island in Queens where they could swim and have a picnic and maybe dance. And they'd return them, and it was a great outing. They got some fresh air, and they got out on the river. And believe it or not, these things were still in operation in the 1930s. Oh, and going back, sometimes they were rafted together. I've seen as many as 4 rafted together for a single excursion, towed by one small steam tug. I want to tell you a little bit about shipbuilding. I live in New Baltimore now, and this shipyard, the Baldwin Shipyard, is a couple doors down from where I live. Of course, steam transportation required shipyards to build these boats, to service them. This is the GVS Quackenbush. She was built in 1878 in New Baltimore. Here she is in her later years being serviced at the Marine Railway in New Baltimore. The tracks are still in the river. That slip is still there. Very interesting. But communities up and down the river built these boats. There were a lot of them. So there was a lot of building taking place in Coxsackie, Athens, Albany, up and down the river. Another variation of steam are the ferries. You know, there were about a dozen important ferry routes on the Hudson River, serviced by ferries like this. sometimes between the larger communities, they were larger boats. Typically, there were one or two of these boats operating at any given time. In Newburgh, between Newburgh and Beacon, there were 2 or 3 big steam ferry boats operating all the time in a continuous motion to get people back and forth across the river. Naturally, there were no bridges until the 1930s, or well, actually, the Bear Mountain Bridge in the late 1920s was the first passenger bridge across the river, I believe. But in the 1930s, other bridges were built, and gradually these ferries were displaced. As we get into the 20th century, the Hudson River Day Line becomes the dominant company operating steamboats, and they begin investing in their fleet. In 1925, we hit the high water mark of steam transportation on the Hudson River, where 2 million passengers are carried. That's a lot of people in a short period of time. The season's relatively short. We're really talking about April, May to September, October, when these boats aren't operating anymore. So to carry 2 million people is quite a bit. They also wanted to celebrate the centennial of Robert Fulton's steamboat in 1807, along with the tricentennial of the Half Moon's arrival on the Hudson River in 1909. So the Hudson-Fulton celebration was scheduled for 1909, and the Day Line began building new boats to serve the public they expected to come out in force to enjoy the river that year. So the first of the new boats they built is this one, the Hendrick Hudson, which was a magnificent boat, beautifully decorated, and they began calling these boats the Hudson River Flyers. They were able to achieve the same speed that the Mary Powell achieved, of somewhere between 22 and 24 miles an hour. And they were very comfortable boats, and they could carry large numbers of passengers. I think this boat carried 2,000 or 3,000 passengers. The Washington Irving was the biggest. She was built in 1913. She had feathering paddle wheels. It was a slightly more efficient arrangement. The wheels could be smaller in diameter, but they were more efficient because the paddles, or what in steamboat business we call buckets, they were always presented to the water in a vertical position. They had an elliptical gear that kept them vertical through the rotational movement, and it made them more efficient. And you can see some of the interiors. This is the writing room on board the Washington Irving. Just magnificent boats. Nobody in the world had anything quite like this on their rivers. And great accommodations for the traveling public, too, with ticket offices. Some of you are probably familiar with the old Day Line ticket office. It was L'Auberge, a French restaurant for a number of years down on Broadway in Albany. It's still with us. Searching for the right owner to begin taking care of her and restoring her, but she's still there to mark where Day Line passengers came and went. And one of our guests tonight told me a story about the flood of people that came out on Broadway and went over to Union Station whenever a steamboat landed here. You can still imagine it. The buildings are still there. Union Station's still there. It was a big deal. They called it Steamboat Square. Peter Stuyvesant was built, I believe, in 1913, and she was the first propeller steamboat that the Day Line put into service. And that's significant because the Hudson River was relatively shallow as we get up above New Baltimore and into Queens and Cedar Hill. You have the overslaw, which was a problem for navigation for hundreds of years. But by now, the Army Corps of Engineers is beginning to dredge the overslaw, making room for boats with deeper bottoms, such as the Peter Stuyvesant, to make it up to Albany. So now propeller boats can go where the flat-bottomed side wheelers were able to go previously. Ultimately, all good things come to an end, and one of the beginnings of that end was the rise of the automobile in the 20th century. It wrought significant changes, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of how people wanted to travel, where they wanted to go, how they wanted to get there. And people began using the automobile instead of the steamboat or the railroad in many instances. And this was followed and accelerated by the Great Depression, which slowed things down for the Hudson River Day Line. And things slowed further during World War II. So after World War II, the Day Line was never as profitable as it had been before the Great Depression. And gradually, the big steamboats that came to Albany only came up to Albany on charter, and most of the business now was between New York, Bear Mountain, and West Point. And finally, diesel propulsion performed better than steam in a lot of measures. And the last steamboat to operate on the Hudson River, passenger steamboat of any size, was the Alexander Hamilton, which ran a charter run in 1971, and she was replaced by the Circle Line's diesel Dayliner, which, nice boat, not quite the same, only built really to bring people to Bear Mountain, and she only did that for a few years, and then she too went away. And by this time, the river really wasn't the place that it was 100 years earlier. It was dirty, it was blighted. People didn't want to spend time in the river anymore. And if they had money, they wanted to get on an airplane and go to Europe, or they wanted to go get a camp in the Adirondacks or do something entirely different. So the old ways of recreating had changed at this point, and the steamboats as we knew them were pretty much gone. I want to go back to the Alexander Hamilton briefly. How many of you in the audience ever remember seeing the Alexander Hamilton? Got a few people. I'm glad to see that. Alexander Hamilton came up to Albany in 1960 or 1961 on a charter run, and I had a chance to see her go through the Dunn Memorial Bridge, which you may remember was a lift bridge back then. And she made her final revenue run as a charter in 1971. She had a number of celebrities on board, including Yoko Ono. A number of old steamboat people were on board, and it was quite a run. She went to Bear Mountain and West Point, and then she was retired. They had her at South Street Seaport for a brief period of time. Nobody was terribly interested in her. The ship preservationists did all they could to try to come up with a new plan for her. Could she be a restaurant? Could she be a floating museum? How much money was it going to take to do something like that? Where could they take her? And while this was happening, she had to leave South Street Seaport. She went over to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for a little while. That didn't work out. She couldn't stay there. And they finally took her to Raritan Bay. Her last stop was at the Long Navy Pier at Raritan Bay. And then in 1977, a severe storm came and tore her up. And that's the end. She was beyond restoration at that point, and people were heartbroken. There was a lot of affection toward the Alexander Hamilton, and there had even been a not-for-profit organization founded to try to come up with a plan to preserve her. When it failed, though, people did the next best thing. They said, we really need to create a museum dedicated to the preservation of the memory of these steamboats. And that was the beginning of our museum, the Hudson River Maritime Museum. I want to show you this one, too. This is the Robert Fulton. She was built in 1909 for the Hudson Fulton celebration. She was sold by the Day Line in 1956 and went to the Bahamas, where she became a dormitory and a recreation hall, and then a hurricane got her. So she didn't make it either. But anyway, the steamboat aficionados helped found the Hudson River Maritime Museum in Kingston. I hope you all get a chance to come down there sometime. It's a terrific institution. In the beginning, the Hudson River Maritime Museum was really dedicated just to the steamboat story and to tugboats. There were a lot of retired tugboat captains that got involved. They wanted to tell stories about towing on the river, and they did a great job with it. But over the years, the museum has broadened its interests to look at all matters of navigation on the river and all the industries that navigation supported and all the ways people have interacted with the river over the past 1,000 or 2,000 years. So we're really trying to tell a much broader story. We're trying to appeal to a very large public. We have a boat school where we're teaching kids how to build wooden boats. We have permanent exhibits on topics such as the Day Line. We have fragments of the great steamers. This is the wheel of the Mary Powell on the right. She's on semi-permanent loan to us from the Senate House Historical Society, Senate House State Historic Site in Kingston, pardon me. Part of the paddle box of the Mary Powell is above her. These are all artifacts that we've assembled from the Mary Powell. And on the left, we have an interactive exhibit on canals in New York State, how they work. Kids get to play with canal boats, move them through mechanical locks, over aqueducts, and they can build their own canal. This kid, who happens to be my grandson, is standing on some of our canal pieces down below. But you can actually take those pieces out and build your own canal and build your own lock if you want to. And one of our proudest achievements recently is we built this all-solar passenger boat to take people out on excursions out on the river and to the lighthouses. This is a Solaris. We launched her in 2019. She is the first Coast Guard certified passenger boat to be all-solar in the United States. And she's performed amazingly. We're very proud of her. We're very committed to environmental conservation and stewardship of the river. And we designed her to look very much like a steam launch of the 19th century. She has that canoe bow. She has very yacht-like lines. But instead of a canvas canopy, she has a plywood canopy with solar collectors on top. And we found that she'll operate even in the dark if we're late bringing people back. She does very well. So,
How big a craft is she?
She's, I'll probably get this off by a little bit. I think she's about 48 feet long or something.
What type of batteries?
I don't know. It's a whole series of batteries that are in the bilge. They're in watertight compartments under the deck. So they also serve as ballast.
I went down with Hudson Valley Community College at a trip last year.
Oh, good.
I was really impressed by the museum, and I went on the boat, and out to the lighthouse, and even that whole area where the museum is, with all the nice little restaurants and shops, you can really make the whole day of it.
Well, great. Well, this gentleman in the front said he went down, took a ride on the boat, and he enjoyed it very much, enjoyed the museum, and thought well of what we were doing.
There's a whole little neighborhood where you can get nice little restaurants and shops, and you can make it a good portion of the day with doing it.
So that's really my story. I'd be happy to take some questions, and we hope you get down to the museum. I've got some literature here. Feel free to take what you'd like, learn more about us, and we hope we'll see you down there. We have the lights. Thank you. Thanks.
I wanted to ask a question about the lifespan of the boats, particularly the wooden ones. And was that lifespan driven by or limited by wear and tear, or was it more economic, a new version, more economic version?
They got a lot of mileage out of these boats, actually. The Mary Powell was launched in 1961, and she was still operating in 1917. They took her out because she was functionally obsolete at that point, but she was still operational. But to maintain a wooden boat, it required a lot of renewal all the time. But they tried to renew them to the extent that they could until technologically something better made more business sense. There was no, with the exception of the Mary Powell and a few other grand old steamboats, there wasn't a lot of sentimentality about the business. Whatever worked and made money was what you did. Yes?
What's the state of any kind of economic activity in the Hudson now? And you talked about stewardship of the river, what's being done to address all the vegetation in the river?
I don't know a whole lot about the vegetation. There are a lot of invasive species that are in there. There's spatterdock, there's water chestnuts, which are Asian. I don't know that anything is being done at this point to control that. Our concern at the museum is try to limit pollution, try to encourage forms of transportation that leave a smaller carbon footprint. And our museum's gone entirely solar, or well, to the extent that we can. Our whole roof is covered with solar panels now. So we're really trying to make that a reality at our end to the extent that we can. But there are a lot of other things. I'm sure that people could address it better than I can about what's being done on the environmental end. Back in the corner.
Yes, going back to the early steamboats, maybe you can explain to me why were they side wheelers as opposed to stern paddle wheels? Was it a horsepower thing, or was it a?
I think it was, it's a very good question. I'm not sure why the stern wheel design never caught on the Hudson River, but it never really did. Apparently the side wheelers worked well. People became used to them, became the tradition here. Now the Mississippi used both side wheelers and stern wheelers.
Can you describe a little about dredging and how deep were the original depths coming up to Albany?
Yeah, originally one of the question was about dredging, and we don't have a completely comprehensive history, but New York State began trying to address the problem of the Albany overslaw as early as the 1820s, and not terribly successfully. I don't think anybody really made much of a dent in it until the late 19th century when you had steam equipment. And in the early 20th century, it became extensive. The Army Corps of Engineers really went at it. They began consolidating islands, dredging up material from the bottom, and putting it around the islands and making the islands larger and trying to create a narrow shipping channel with its own environmental consequences.
Did they ever run into rock and have real difficulties?
Yes, New Baltimore. They had a rock ledge in New Baltimore that required blasting in order to get the depth that they needed. And it was a limiting factor. It was one of the reasons that sloops and schooners with relatively shallow drafts were the best way to reach Albany in the early years. And but as technology improved and steamboats became bigger, there was obviously a need to try to make the river accommodate that, particularly up here. Yes?
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey in Edgewater, which is just below the Washington Bridge. There used to be a restaurant called the Binghamton. It was an old, I'm sure it was a ferry boat.
Yep, it was a ferry.
And then I think it burned down a few years ago.
Well, it sank. And it got broken up, and we have her name board, we have a couple of her benches, and we have a couple of her doors, sadly. But yeah, she was quite a landmark. She was red, white, and blue for a number of years on the shoreline.
That's good food, too.
Yeah. Yes?
I have an original print of the engineer's dredging plan from 1890, signed by the original engineer. It's really incredible what's on there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of faded, but...
That's great.
And just a question, it may be crazy, but the paddle wheels, did they operate individually?
No. They were on a continuous crankshaft. It would have been interesting if they had done that, but you'd need two engines to do that.
And the Storm King is the skeleton of that is still in Coxsackie, right?
The bones of the Storm King are right there by the public dock. They just recently, New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation built a new park in Coxsackie, but fortunately they respected the remains of the Storm King, and she's still there.
I remember years ago the propeller was still on it. Somebody got that.
That's gone, but the propeller armature is still there.
Yep.
The engine bed's still there, and you can still get a sense of her size and length and breadth at low tide in particular. Yes?
A comment. We were down at the museum a couple of years ago. It was a fantastic little jewel
Thank you.
that I would recommend that everybody in this room, And it's just a delight. We've had friends down there, they felt the same way.
Great.
It's really unique.
Well, thank you for saying that. We work hard to do the best we can.
$5, I think, wasn't that the original?
Yes, sir.
How did they turn around a 400-foot long boat?
They didn't do it very often.
Well, if they're coming up from New York to Albany, then they got to turn around and go back to New York,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. They managed it.
The Albany Yacht Club was on a long pier that was connected by a bridge from about where the railroad station is in Albany. Oh, better yet, the building on Broadway was the Dayline ticket office and stands today, right on Broadway. And it was last a restaurant. And you would go there to buy your ticket and walk out, and there was a tunnel that went under 2 or 3 tracks, and out there was the boat tied up headed for New York at 9:20. There was the Robert Fulton, which had a walking beam. There was the Hendrick Hudson, which had side wheels, and that was the largest of the boats. It was over 400 feet, carried 5,000 people. And I'll get to the turnaround. How the turnaround? The Albany Yacht Club was behind and across from where the ticket office was, and it was on a huge pier. It was a city block long, and you got access to it by a bridge that you could walk across or drive across. When the boats came in from New York, they would pull up on the outboard side of that long pier, and then they would be backed using lines, backed around, and so that when they got to the shore at Albany, the stern was back, the bow was forward, they were ready to sail tomorrow morning at 9:20. And they were tied up at the pier at 6:20. I lived in Upper 2nd Avenue in the 30s and 40s, and I could ride my bike down to where the Gun Memorial Bridge was, and when I'd hear the whistle blow and raise the bridge, I could get down there in time to see the boat go under the bridge, and then I would go up to the yacht club, I'd watch it turn around, I did all that thing. And how'd I do it? I'm 92 today.
We got time for a couple more questions. I know the library wants everyone to get home at a reasonable time, but yes, sir.
Do you know anything about the trolley museum across the street from you guys when they open up?
No, I don't know when they're open. I don't know their schedule. We hope in the future to do a little bit more with them. They have a stop right at the museum, and I've always been a believer in critical mass. If you have enough attractions in a small area, you can get a lot of people to come down and enjoy it. So I think that's got a great future out of it. They run, during the season, they run antique trolleys out to Kingston Point, and it's a nice ride. Yes, sir.
Were the heat barges used to be ice, or were there separate boats, ice trade?
They'd run them until they couldn't go through the ice anymore.
I'm talking about harvesting ice.
Oh,
Up here, taking it down.
I don't believe so. There was a specialized barge used for ice, and a lot of them were painted yellow, and a lot of them had windmills on top, and the windmills were to pump the meltwater out of them. So it was a very specialized type. In fact, the shipwreck that's at Henry Hudson Park, I believe, is the bones of an ice barge.
There were big ice piers at Cedar Hill.
Yeah, so I think that's a remnant of that industry.
What was the dock at Cedar Hill? Was it the Winnie dock?
Yeah. Well, you mean up from Cedar Hill. Winnie Dock is something separate. That's at Van Wee Point. You know, the question was about the Winnie Dock at Van Wee Point. It was a very important place because during the period of low rain and low water in Hudson River, a lot of boats would unload at the Winnie Dock, and the freight would be carried to Albany by wagon when the boats couldn't make it further up the river because of the overslaw. And there's a very old 17th century, late 17th century house right near the Winnie Dock. Yes, sir.
Where is the shipwreck in Henry Hudson Park? And is it visible if you're
It's visible at low tide, and it's to the north of where the current boat ramp is. Yep. Yes, sir.
That barge, my family used to own where the town park is.
Oh.
The whole town park, right down where the sewer plant is.
Mm-hmm.
And that barge was put there by Callahan's, I was told by my grandfather and my dad.
Okay.
And that was because when they were dredging the river, whatever, Callahan's also used that. There used to be a crane sitting there. Some of the remnants of a crane, you can still see.
Okay. That makes sense.
But Callahan's used to back their trucks onto that barge and to dump into another barge.
Okay. So it became kind of a dock.
It was basically a dock, yep.
Okay.
But it was floating back to that.
I didn't know that. That's great.
And there was a crane there up until the 60s.
You can still see some of the steel from that there. Any other questions? Well, I guess not. Well, it's been a pleasure. I'm glad everybody came out. Thank you.